Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world. There is a lot going on in America. We've gotten through Halloween, we've gotten through another election, we've gotten through the World Series, but there's the story brewing and brimming beneath the surface for going on 11 months now that we've got to go deeper on, and we've got the perfect guest to do it. I'm very happy he could make time to join us. The great and powerful Scott Macfarlane joins us here on Independent Americans. Welcome, Scott.
Nice to be here, Paul.
I'm a big fan of your work, and I don't know if we've actually ever met in person or not on the Hill, but I've been watching all that you do, and I want to get into all the latest around the trials, around what I think is maybe the biggest story of the year, which is the insurrection and everything that comes after it. But let me ask you. You've been deep in it. You've been doing some incredibly, I think, innovative journalism. Let's start with a question I ask of all my guests, Scott. Where are you, and how are you?
I'm fine. You caught me on the one day I'm not in Washington, D.C. in 2021. Make a road trip up to upstate New York to see some family. I thought it was going to be a quiet week. There hasn't been a quiet week since January 6th. But that notwithstanding, we're going to hit the first anniversary of the Capitol insurrection before we see the first trial. And it's starting to sink in with people that this is a long process. It's going to be measured in months, in years, and not days and weeks. So really, there is no day off for those covering January 6th and its aftermath, what I believe to be a continuous story that will transcend this year and will go on for many years to come.
I want to go deeper into that. Let's talk. How is it for you, Scott? You've been covering this during the pandemic. There are security concerns. I see you from the Capitol, from inside. But how has this been for you and the people around you doing this over the last year?
Well, it's not that popular on the home front because it involves weekend work. Because there's so many cases, Paul. The court filings keep coming in on Saturday, on Sunday, on Mother's Day, on holidays. So and we got to keep up with it. So it's been a little bit of a hamster on a wheel. And there are 650 plus cases so far. So there's a lot to get your hands around. And anybody tracking this closely will tell you that 650 is not the ceiling. We're somewhere toward the ceiling, but there are dozens, if not hundreds, more cases to come.
So that's where I want to start, if I can. Okay, so we're coming up on the anniversary, right? It's right around November 6th as we record this. It's been 11 months basically. Let's start with the denominator. How many? Break it down for people who maybe aren't following your Twitter feed, which is a must. But how many people have been arrested? How many people are in the trial system? How can you describe the scope of this? And do we know how many are still at large? Do we know how many they're hunting right now and have not been captured by the FBI yet?
That's a trickier question than you think, because first, the numbers are fluid because there are arrests being made every week, and the FBI and the Justice Department don't hand you over a list and say, here's who we have this week, here's what we've got going. They're not announcing them. They're not putting them in press releases. They're not giving you a scorecard. And as you all have noticed, they're not giving regular updates or press briefings. In fact, this zero press briefings since the Capitol insurrection from the Justice Department. So a lot of this is a puzzle we have to piece together. And what we've pieced together so far is you have about 650 federal defendants in the U.S. Capitol insurrection. We know from testimony from the U.S. Capitol Police Chief, there were at least 800 people illegally in the Capitol that day. And we know some number of people we've seen charged never got inside the Capitol. They committed crimes, according to the prosecutors, outside the Capitol, chemical spraying police, punching police. So the ceiling could go to 1,000, could go above 1,000, and we're at 650 now. And we see the court filings, Paul, how prosecutors are finding or connecting some of these defendants to the crimes. It's through the omnipresent social media images and videos that exist. And the surveillance videos that exist. There's colorful imagery of these defendants inside the Capitol. So we know they're using those surveillance cameras to connect people to the crime. And if there were 800 people illegally inside the Capitol, logic tells you there may be hundreds more to come.
Okay, so if that's our starting point, and I want to go deeper on why they're not doing press briefings, the precedent around that. But maybe before we go deeper into the folks that have been arrested that are in that process, I try to track and share the word on how many people the FBI is hunting down. It's 11 months later. I go back, I'm teaching a class on 9/11 at Amherst College this semester, right? I'm teaching my students what it was like after 9/11. The idea that there's seems to be so little urgency, or just that it's taking so long. I think back to the Boston Marathon bombing. I think about other, what I would call terrorist attacks, and I think this is a domestic terrorist attack. What is going on with how many people are at large right now who are walking the streets, to include, it looks like, the person who set a pipe bomb outside of the DNC and RNC hasn't been captured yet. Can you talk about who we know is at large and the FBI is trying to hunt down right now?
You started with the right one. The person who left pipe bombs, active, destructive pipe bombs outside the Democratic and Republican Party headquarters. There's no arrest. As far as we can tell, there's no suspect. The FBI continues to solicit tips. That's really, to me, the top line, who's still out there. There are others, clearly others who were inside the Capitol that day. There are others who are unlawfully inside specific members' offices, who assaulted police, who damaged historic property that have yet to be arrested. That being said, there is some progress. I mean, the federal system tends to move at a slower pace, and in 10 months, there have already been 650 arrests. You do the math, they're averaging X number of arrests a day, X number of arrests a week. We know the FBI is doing surveillance, undercover surveillance around suspects' communities, around their homes or workplaces. We know this because the FBI has used the surveillance imagery and testimony in charging documents in some of the currently charged cases. So we know that nearly every FBI field office is now part of this investigation because people came from all across the country to be part of the Capitol insurrection. We know defendants are from nearly every state. So this is a nationwide investigation, not a regional one. That's going to take more time. As far as the court cases, though, Paul,
please,
that's where the timetable can get more tricky. I mentioned earlier, we won't have a trial before the first anniversary. We may not have trials even in early 2022 at this point. And that's partly because of COVID, limiting the functions of the courthouse. And there's still a backlog of pandemic era cases to get through before they get to the January 6 cases. But what's more, they have 650 cases, all going through one courthouse, the Washington, D.C. federal courthouse just down the road from Capitol Hill. There's only so many judges, only so many prosecutors, only so many federal defenders, and only so much time on the calendar. And then there's the big issue. This is the most pressing issue as we speak right now. There's an unprecedented mountain of evidence that has to be processed by prosecutors, prepared by law for defense attorneys, synthesized, comprehended, and readied for trial. And they're just not getting there. They just can't get to the end of that road because more evidence keeps coming in every day. And there's all that video, Paul, all those social media posts. There is 10,000 plus hours of U.S. Capitol surveillance video that could be relevant. If you and I sat down to start watching that video right now, we'd finish in 2023. So this is what we're dealing with. And people who want justice quickly are going to be wildly disappointed.
So, Scott, do we have a precedent domestically? I feel like this is the America's Most Wanted story from when I was growing up as a kid, but it's like on public access, meaning it hasn't been elevated. There are no press briefings on a regular basis. The president's not holding up a picture and saying, this is enemy number one. The head of the FBI is not doing that. Let's just use the bomber as an example. Someone tried to plant pipe bombs at the headquarters of the two parties of the United States, right? During all of this. Are they putting against this resources that we can compare it to on anything else, the Boston massacre bombing, anything like that? Because it feels to me like they're not really putting everything into it, right? And most of all, they're not communicating with the American people other than the Twitter feed where they say, hey, do you know this guy? Grainy footage of some guy with a MAGA hat on, right? And those go out and we try to share them. But why are they not holding up whatever they know? They know what sneakers they wore, right? They know the sweatshirt. Why is that not being held up for the American people every day asking for their help?
Or why not be courting public opinion and seeking higher level charges against those they have caught? Why not go out there and reinforce, here's why we have to hold all these people accountable and pursue prison time for all these people. They're not using the pulpit or the platform for that either. Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, it's long been precedent for the U.S. Justice Department not to speak publicly about open, pending cases. That said, this is an unprecedented event, so maybe it's time to consider breaking with precedent. That notwithstanding, the law enforcement agency that began this investigation, at the heart of the investigation, the U.S. Capitol Police, one of the few, if not the only police force in America that really isn't subject to any transparency. They don't have to tell you anything. They don't have to issue police reports. They don't have a review board that meets publicly. They're not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Unlike your local police department, U.S. Capitol Police doesn't have to answer publicly to pretty much anybody. So there's this culture of secrecy or opacity that's transcended in January 6th and has been from the start. That being said, I'll tell you, this vacuum that exists of information from the federal government about January 6th, be it pipe bombs, charge cases, the investigation, the safety of the Capitol, there are some in media who are trying to fill that vacuum. I think I'm one of them. And I can tell you, people are just starving for information about it. The engagements I get are by orders of magnitude wildly higher than the most engaging thing I've ever reported on a non-January 6th story, because people are craving information and they're just not getting it. So the people who, those of us who are trying to put this puzzle together or keep updated on the largest criminal investigation in U.S. history, we have a lot of people coming to see what we know.
Well, I think what you're doing is a tremendous public service. It's vital, but it's also unique. Like, I go to you because you're on the beat, you're in the courtrooms, or you're around it, and you know what's happening. And, there's a nationwide manhunt happening on a daily basis. People are getting their doors knocked on, but it's not being reported. And I kind of compare it to the war on terrorism in the early days, right? We knew it seemed like a new top leader of Al-Qaeda was killed every week, right? The Defense Department would say, okay, we got the latest top leader of Al-Qaeda. Here's that person's name. Here's how we got them. There were regular reports about a national security priority, right? How are we doing against a threat or an enemy? And the Pentagon has said, the president has said, I think they're right in saying that domestic terrorism is the number one national security threat. So is it only the FBI here? Where is the breakdown in that transparency? Like, I know there are political forces at play here, but why, and I understand why maybe Biden doesn't want to do this, but why isn't the head of the FBI, why isn't the head of the police force engaging with the public on this? And the ones that they're already doing, it's just a matter of, like, they're posting it on Twitter already, right? So it's not like they're not releasing the information. Why aren't they amplifying it beyond that? Is it that they're checking a box? Is it that there aren't enough resources? What answer do they give you when you ask, why does Jen Psaki not tell us every day how we're doing on this and who's still at large?
I don't pretend to know the politics of this, but that may be an indication of what the politics are, the people studying the politics, that they're trying to make a decision that doesn't cause political trouble. But put all that aside, because that's way outside my area of expertise. What I can tell you is what the FBI is doing, what the U.S. Capitol Police are doing, what the U.S. Justice Department is doing is customary. This is how they roll with open cases. They don't get out there. They don't get out there and bang a drum. They don't get out there and reinforce the importance of a case. It's just their practice. Is that the right practice in this singular historic American moment? I don't know, but I'm not sure anybody's being well served by there being a culture of silence on something that viscerally and transcendently impacted Americans, horrified Americans. I'll just tell you, my then 7-year-old was with me in the base of my house January 6th. I was covering January 6th from home because of COVID. I was covering the Electoral College certification from home. And then I started seeing the images everybody started seeing on TV. And my son saw in my eyes the fear, the horror of the person at the Senate president's desk. That first image of somebody who's in the Senate chamber, we're at the Senate president's desk. Something came across my eyes because my little guy went running out of the room crying because he'd never seen daddy scared before. So let's put that in context. Americans have that reaction to January 6th. They remain starving for information and hungry for justice, and they're just not getting information. They're not getting updates. They're not getting the cathartic, here's where things stand, here's where we're going, everything's going to be all right. And I think that's a problem. That said, what the FBI is doing, what Capitol Police are doing, what Justice Department officials are doing is customary in the criminal justice system.
And I'm glad you're putting that humanity around it, because I remember similarly being at home covering all of this and saying to my wife, they breached the Capitol. They're
Mhm.
inside. And as a national security person, I know what that means. Okay, they got inside, and that was huge. It was a huge breach of security, but the way things have followed since has been lacking in my view in that urgency. So I think about our kids. I think about the message we're sending. And I think about the fact that there is not, outside of you, a cacophony of media folks that are covering this. It feels like it's not news. There aren't even perp walks, right? Like on the big ones. Like usually you'd see a perp walk, right? The guy's in handcuffs. He's being pulled out of his house. He's being walked inside. If a white girl goes missing, it's national news, for weeks, and we're all following every single clue. But here, that is missing. And part of what's also missing is what's happening inside. You've been covering that very well. Let me ask you to describe. We had Matt Zeller talk about conditions inside resettlement camps, but I feel like we don't know what's happening to these people inside jails or prisons or wherever they are. Can you paint that picture for us? Because you've been illuminating it and talking about the organizing that's going on inside and around that. Paint the picture for us of the folks that are being held. Where are they? What's their life like, and what's the story there?
Less than 10% of the defendants are in jail pending trial. There are, again, 650 or so defendants. By my reporting, there are 45 in the Washington, D.C. jail pre-trial. Now, the Washington, D.C. jail for nearly 50 years, even by jail standards, has been considered, to put it charitably, subpar and a really tough place to serve time. We know, speaking with some of the defendants who've been in that jail and their attorneys, the January 6 defendants are kept in the same wing of the jail. They called it the J6 wing informally among the correctional officers. The inmates call it the Patriot wing. They have a morning or evening singing of the national anthem. They're all together. They're segregated from the rest of the unit. I think there's an argument to be made. It's for everyone's safety. There's an argument to be made that it's a special treatment of them and they don't deserve that. That's an argument for a different day. The DC jail warden and the DC jail director have been found in contempt of court by a federal judge for their handling of court orders for overseeing the medical care of the January 6 defendants, at least one of them. And that jail has a track record of having subpar medical care complaints. That jail has a track record of having problems with its physical plant, its heating and air conditioning systems. It's leaking from the roof. It's not a good place. All that being said, there are two units in the Washington, D.C. jail. There's the older, even more rickety central detention facility, and there's the relatively newer and more desirable central treatment facility. The January 6 defendants are in the newer, more desirable central treatment facility. The central detention facility is where people who get arrested in and around D.C. have to serve their time. And just this week, the U.S. Marshal Service announced it was going to evacuate 400 defendants from the central detention facility, that older facility, because of subpar conditions and move them elsewhere. That's how bad things are at the jail. But to put it all in context, less than 10% of the people arrested for the U.S. Capitol insurrection are actually in jail pending trial. But those are there, Paul. They've been there a while. Yeah. They've been there 10 months. That's time that they'll get credit for if sentenced to prison time down the road. But people who want to exact a pound of flesh have gotten a little bit of a pound of flesh from those 45 in pretrial detention.
And would you project, Scott, that when do we start to see them go to trial? What does that timeline look like for those 45 as a starting point? Or do they go through the people who have been released with lower charges first? How's that order of march going to go over the next couple of months?
Well, you would think everyone would prioritize the pretrial detained defendants to go to trial first. I mean, they're in jail. They should go to the front of the line. I mean, and that's a natural instinct and a natural rhythm of the justice system. They're going to have to prioritize the defendants who are in pretrial custody to go to trial first because they haven't been convicted of anything. They haven't pleaded guilty to anything. But charitably, I think it would be at the end of winter. Think post Super Bowl. Think post Valentine's Day. And honestly, in some of these cases, it's both parties agreeing to the delays because the defense lawyers haven't corralled all the evidence they want to have at their fingertips. The defense attorneys may not want to go first to trial and be the canary in the coal mine of what's to come in front of a DC jury. So I think we're a ways off. What are we getting now? We're getting closure of the lower level cases. the misdemeanors. Defendants pleading guilty, some actually already being sentenced. And that in itself, if you separate that from the rest of the cases, that's a talker. I mean, how the Justice Department is disposing of these low-level cases has got people ticked off.
Yeah, can we pause there? Because that's what I wanted to go deeper on that. And last week you quoted the judge who had some pretty stern words on how this is going. But at least for me, there's a feeling like some folks are getting off easy, like some folks are getting to go, to work out or go to Mexico on vacation. There are these cases, right? Can you paint that picture for us here? I mean, are they getting off easy, or is this what happens and we don't normally see it? When someone has has a lawyer, and the lawyer pleads, hey, my client needs to go on vacation or go to my son's football game. Can you paint the picture of what some of those pleas have been like? And I don't know if you have a sense what percentage have been granted and how that compares to, the average DC person who got arrested and is in that jail right now.
So two different threads you're pulling out here. Let's separate them. First of all, let's talk about the people who are getting permission to do things before their cases go to trial. And some of them seem like pretty provocative requests. I want to go to Mexico for my regular vacation this year. I want to go to the beach with my kids. I want to go to the October 10th Pittsburgh Steelers Denver Broncos NFL game at Pittsburgh. So I'm a big Steeler fan. And judges,
which was an actual request. An actual request. Yeah,
it was an actual request that was honored. The judge said yes, and that shouldn't be a surprise. I'm told by legal experts, including a former federal prosecutor, who says judges just tend not to exact penalties before somebody's convicted of something, before somebody pleads guilty. If the court system deemed this person safe and worthy of release from jail pre-trial, there shouldn't be a next level limitation on their travel if properly reported and properly notified ahead of a guilty plea or of a conviction. And there's a strong argument to be made that the requests being been honored so far are trips and travel that have been supervised. They notified you in advance. They told you when they're going, where they're going to stay, what their hotel is, when they're coming home, how to reach them. So they're still being supervised on pretrial release. That's happening. Most of the requests I've seen made have been honored. And those are likely and largely in the lower level cases where somebody's not charged with conspiracy or chemical spraying police or being there with tactical gear. The second thread is one that's going to be relevant for months to come. That's the sentencing for defendants who do plead guilty. What kind of leniency are they being shown? That is a meaty topic because that's what's going first. And that's somewhat logical that the first set of cases you close out are the ones that where defendants aren't accused of hurting anybody, assaulting anyone, breaking anything, didn't come in there with, an earpiece and a shield and tactical helmets. And those are defendants who were only inside for a few minutes, pleaded guilty early. They were quick to plead guilty. Federal government usually honors that. And they say they're sorry, which is not insignificant. So we've watched.
Are they flipping too, Scott? Are they flipping up and giving them more information about a broader conspiracy and what they know? Is that a key part of that?
Yes and no. I mean, these defendants acknowledge they've made what they call a proffer. They've met with the feds and told them what they know. I'm not sure what they have to offer because these are not the defendants accused of conspiracy, plotting, or planning. They may have told the FBI everything they know, and they offer to tell them more if there's more that's relevant, but they may not have a whole lot, which is why their cases are being disposed of quickly. If you've got somebody who's got a lot of information, they're not going to sentencing anytime soon. The feds will squeeze every drop of intel out of that person and give them credit for it before they go to sentencing. So before I go into the misdemeanor guilty pleas, there have been a few guilty pleas in the high-level cases, the accused oath keepers, the accused plotters and planners, those who came to the Capitol, according to prosecutors, with tactical gear, encrypted communications, and a game plan. They were ready for battle. Some of them have pleaded guilty, and we haven't heard boo about their cases since the guilty pleas. And I don't expect to see those people in a courtroom anytime soon because they've flipped. They've agreed to cooperate, and they've got a hell of a lot to offer. These misdemeanor defendants, I think they told what they know, and the prosecutors deemed them worthy of going to sentencing. There's not much more we need out of them. And they go to sentencing. They say they're sorry. They say they so many of them, Paul, say they were caught up in the moment. It was a spur of the moment thing. Judges haven't really liked that phrase, but it's been somewhat impactful. I've seen jail sentences of 30 days, 2 weeks, home detention, probation, $500 restitution charges, which, $500. This thing has cost us hundreds of
So let's
millions
talk
of
about that
dollars.
as an example, if we can, Scott. So, like someone who got fined $500, they were in the Capitol. They were inside the building and trespassed. And in my view, like if you would have told me these people did this 5 years ago, I'd say they'd all be dead. Like I've been in the Capitol so many times. There's no way they would go inside without being shot or detained. But they went inside. Let's just talk about people who breached the Capitol, which to me, as someone who spent so much time in D.C., was unfathomable. I've been on the floor of the House. I've been inside those buildings. I know what those security perimeters are like. But people who went inside, who went through the Capitol, maybe got a $500 fine. They were a part of a national security threat, and then they were allowed to go to a Pittsburgh Steelers game with a huge crowd. That's a big, soft national security target. It seems like, if you can answer that question for me, but also, it seems like they're not treating it like a national security threat. If these were Muslim guys 20 years ago, they would be in Guantanamo and it would be a national security threat and they would be treating it that way. But it seems to be inconsistent in the way the prosecutions and the judgments are using whether or not it's actually a national security threat. Does
Sure,
that seem
sure.
right?
That's the question I get every day, and I got to tell you, it's a relevant question. There are people who view January 6th. I assume an awful lot of people who view January 6th as a binary situation. If you were part of it, you need to go to prison for a long time. If you were any part of this, any part of trying to overthrow democracy, any part of a crowd that had a gallows and a noose was trying to hang Mike Pence and kill Nancy Pelosi and kill unknown others who came so close to doing that, you need to be in prison for a long time, no matter if you were a foot soldier, a pawn, a bishop, a king, or a knight. You need to be in prison for a long time. Um, there are others who view this with a more of a broad perspective that you didn't do a whole hell of a lot. You clearly weren't part of plotting or planning. You were there and you went with the crowd. And when you got inside, you decided, I'm not going to punch a cop. I'm not going to steal priceless art off the walls. I'm sorry, leave feces on the floor of our Capitol. So maybe 30 days in the lockup, $500, and a name damaged for Google for all time is a sufficient punishment. And I'm not trying to say who's right-headed or wrong-headed. I just know my inbox, my phone are saturated with messages from people who view it as there's two possibilities. You were part of this, you need to go to prison for a long time, or you weren't part of this.
When can you talk about maybe the most noteworthy cases? I mean, we're talking about the Oath Keepers and the conspirators, the planners, which in my view are domestic terrorists and need to be treated as such. But can you talk about maybe the most egregious assaults on cops, maybe stories that people haven't heard? Give us an example of two of maybe the most shocking cases that have been brought forward at this time that we know happened, and maybe they took a plea or they didn't. But give us an example of one or two or three of the most egregious cases that you're covering.
I'm still struck most, Paul, by police on police crime. I mean, there are a number of people who are charged with January 6th who were, at the time, active duty police officers or recently retired police officers. And these include defendants, at least one defendant accused of hand-to-hand combat with a police officer. So that's always going to jump out at me. You talk about the non-physical assaults. How about the verbal assault these police took? Reading through a case file this morning, a defendant who is in pretrial detention accused of using racial epithets and then calling the police communists and then calling the police any number of words I wouldn't ever want to say out loud. The police had to take that intake all day, in addition to the intake of chemical spray. And yeah, we've got defendants accused of using chemical spray against police, bear spray, more potent than that mace or pepper spray you may have sniffed once in your life, using hockey sticks, baseball bats, metal poles, sharpened American flagpoles, using makeshift weaponry against our police officers. It's hard to divorce yourself from that reality when you read through those cases. I monitor those cases most closely because I feel like somebody's going to have to detail for me how somebody drove to Washington, D.C. with a gallows and erected it and nobody stopped him. How somebody walked up to the Capitol with a baseball bat and no one stopped him. And I'll tell you something else. I watch those cases and I want to know who funded the travel, the equipment, and the weaponry.
Yeah, I mean that's what we would do if it was Al Qaeda. The parallel I always challenge people to think about from a national security standpoint is if it was not a domestic group, if it was a foreign group that got to this point, that achieved, arguably, I think, a significant military objective. They got in, which is that in of itself is a victory for them and will be for a long time. If this was a foreign entity, we'd be drilling them all down. We'd be questioning the hell out of them. We'd be holding them. We'd be restricting their travel. We'd be following their money. We'd be, extraditing them. I mean, it would be a full court press. But here, that's not what's happening. And let me ask you part of this that I think is also maybe most egregious, Scott. There's at least one case of a guy who participated in January 6th, then enlisted in the military, got put on active duty at Fort Bragg, and then they went and got him at Fort Bragg. So he was a part of this, not when he was in the military, but afterward, he made it through the military screening. That's, we've talked about extremism on this show. I had Jeremy Butler, who had testified before Congress about it. I've argued there is a significant problem with extremism inside the military and inside the veterans community. We don't know how big it is, but we know it's serious. This is maybe a really important example. The military missed this guy, right? Like he was there, and then he was on active duty at Fort Bragg, and they arrest him there.
Yeah, I don't pretend to know how background checks fail in the way you describe them. But I tell you, I watched Jeremy's testimony as well. I watched the Congressional House Veterans Affairs Committee testimony earlier this fall about extremism in the military. And there was an awful lot of sobering realizations there. First of all, let's put this in the big picture. There were dozens, if not eventually hundreds of people with military connections, veterans or active duty, who were part of January 6th, according to prosecutors. And you wonder if that's by happenstance or if extreme groups are very much targeting military for recruitment, because people in the military are influencers in their community. If you're an extremist group and you lure a member of the military to join, there's a force of magnitude there. They bring other people with them because they're influencers. People want to follow that military man in their community. And members of the military, you know better than me, particularly good at planning strategic work, how to work as a team in a combat situation, how to equip, how to be ready for variables. I mean, there are people there, Paul, with tourniquets and first aid kits. Tell me they weren't ready for something.
Yeah.
So the military's presence on January 6th is absolutely sobering.
So let me ask you to take this forward. As you know, in predicting, we try to look ahead at what's next, what's to come, what are the other pieces. You're talking about a timeline that rolls into next year. It rolls into the midterms. Is there a scenario, Scott, where the midterms directly impact this, where if there's a change in the House, a change in leadership, that this can be slowed down, that this can be stopped, that this can be diverted? Can you talk about the midterm or anything else that might be on the horizon that can either accelerate or impede the progress of this process?
I don't know if the House Select January 6th committee survives the midterms, at least not till January 2023. I don't know if that investigative muscle is going to remain. And they're looking at the bigger picture. The Justice Department is trying to investigate crime at the Capitol and the criminals who were part of it. The January 6th committee is trying to figure out what led up to all this, what gave rise to an insurrection, what were the conditions, who were the players that were relevant and helped produce that crime that occurred January 6th. That's an tenuous spot. I spoke with a couple members of that committee who said they hope to have their work wrapped up by spring or summer 2022. They may have to. They may have to be done by then.
Right.
Who knows if that thing exists? Would the Justice Department's investigation change at all based on political fortunes and midterms? I don't know. How do you think it's gone so far for the Democratic Party? How did election night go this year for Democrats running for office in the context of the largest criminal prosecution in American history playing out in real time? I don't know who benefits or who's hurt politically by insurrection trials, by insurrection plea deals, or by the ongoing prosecutions. Because I'll tell you right now, the party in power has not seen any political benefit from holding accountable those who try to tear down America.
Can I ask you, Scott, to talk about maybe the opposite of what you do, which is what Tucker Carlson is doing and what other, I would argue, bad actors are doing that are trying to paint this as something very different, right? Tucker Carlson now has this series of videos. I don't even want to mention him except that it's dangerous. And I think he is manufacturing and mobilizing a degree of focus and energy around that moment as a rally cry. He's flipping it on its head and saying this was a time where they came after patriotic Americans, they came after people who care about their country. He posted a video where he paired it to the debathification in Iraq after Saddam. So basically saying they came for these people who were patriots and they're coming for you. Can you talk about how that other type of media is influencing these cases? Is it influencing these cases? If they go to a jury, will they influence the jury? Can you talk about the broader media environment that this is happening in and how that's impacting things?
I don't know how it impacts public opinions, but do you know who hates that stuff? The DC federal judges. They make it unequivocal when they're speaking at hearings or issuing orders that the ongoing denialism about reality of the election of 2020, the ongoing lies. One judge even got more granular and said Donald Trump's suggestion he may come back to power soon is reason to hold defendants in jail because it makes them more of an ongoing threat. It's a reason to keep release conditions strict because those defendants are an ongoing threat in the context of the lies and the false information being given about elections and about the insurrection itself. So it's not going to help the currently charged defendants because ultimately they're going to face two groups of people, the judges and DC jurors. And we've seen a number of defendants, a growing number, Paul, who've sought to get their cases moved to different jurisdictions. A defendant from Maine wants his case to be heard in Maine. A defendant from East Texas wants his case to be heard in East Texas. They both, and in all these cases where they're seeking changes of venue, say the DC jurors are helplessly liberal and politically poisoned by coverage of January 6th. They've been seeing so much of January 6th that you can't get a fair jury in front of DC jurors. Let's see how the Tucker Carlson's arguments play in front of DC jurors, because as of now, not one judge has agreed to move one case.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Let me ask you another specific question, Scott. I'm going to keep drawing the parallels to after 9/11. So folks went to, people were detained and sent to Guantanamo, were released, and then the argument was you can't release them because they'd go back on the battlefield, right, and kill Americans. That ended up happening, right? Some people were detained, put in various American prisons, whether they were military or here in other places in black sites, and then eventually were released and were eventually back on the battlefield, blowing up guys like me, right? Has there been any cases of anyone who's been released so far where they've done something else afterward?
Yeah, we've seen a number of defendants either break with the court's expectations or break the law, break the court's orders. Not in the way you just painted the picture. Nobody's gone back to try to stop the Electoral College certification from happening again, because it's going to be a while until that process goes through again. We haven't seen others try to, join mobs and run up onto the Capitol. I don't think any were arrested for that large and sweeping September 18th rally in Washington, D.C. But we have seen defendants who have been sent back to jail for violating the court's expectations. How about the defendant from Virginia, a former local police officer who was released pre-trial in his case, and according to the prosecutors and the judge, broke the court order by buying 34 guns in one purchase. The judge says we banned you from possessing a firearm, so buying 34 of them doesn't really follow the spirit of what we've ordered you to do, so you're back in jail, and quickly. We have actually a particularly interesting defendant who's just facing misdemeanor charges, the lowest level charges, likely wouldn't see a day in prison, not many days at a minimum. She's in jail pre-trial because she kept violating the court orders. She kept violating what the judges told her to do, and so they threw her in jail for absolute disgraceful rejection of court's authority. She's pleaded not guilty. We'll see what happens in her case, but we see defendants try to get right back out there and do what they want to do, not what they're required to do pre-trial.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a scenario that we can envision where Trump runs for re-election, and he treats these people the same way he's treated war criminals. There were cases of military personnel that were tried and accused and some convicted of war crimes and held up as heroes. and brought out to Trump rallies. There could be very well a case where somebody goes to trial, whether they do time or they don't, and they leave as heroes, as martyrs, as rally points, and they're on the trail with Trump in 3 years from now. I mean, I can see that happening. I can see that being a part of this dialogue. Is there a ringleader? Is there a hero? We know Ashley Babbitt was the woman shot inside the Capitol. She's been held up as a martyr. She's dead. Is there anyone who's alive, who's one to watch? Who's the Muqtada al-Sadr of this group that is rising up and that we need to watch for in years to come, who might run for Congress or something else down the line?
Well, I mean, Ashley Babbitt is the one. And I think you nailed it there. But I would also watch the legal defense funds some of these defendants put up and how fast they become flush with money. Put up a GoFundMe for a January 6th defendant, see how many people cut checks. There are those who've had a media profile, who've cut a media profile, and they get a lot of requests. They get a lot of calls. For example, how about the guy who put his feet on Nancy Pelosi's office desk and took her mail, according to prosecutors, and left a vulgar note behind, according to prosecutors? He's had a pretty full dance card. A lot of people have put him on television. I'll admit to being one of them because he has things to say, and I felt it was important for the public to hear some of what he had to say about his case, what he thought was going to happen, what he thought about the conditions in the Washington, D.C. jail. He's getting platforms. I think those platforms should be cautious about what they give him a platform to talk about. But these defendants are cutting a profile in their communities. And I wouldn't be surprised if many were the most famous person in town now, if many like that they're Googleable as being part of the Capitol riot. And I would think for some number of people, this is reinforcing their beliefs, giving them credibility with a certain number of people, a certain type of people, and it's a cause celebre.
Yeah, I mean, there's some congressional districts where this will get you elected. This will get you elected in some, congressional districts in America, and I can see that coming. I mean, there's a day in the future where an insurrectionist is serving in Congress next to Ruben Gallego, who was on this show, who was in the Capitol, who's a former Marine. I can see that happening. I mean, that may not be probable, but it's possible the way this is unfolding right now and the kind of upside down world that this has become. Scott, I'm going to ask you if you can stick around for our Patreon members for a couple rapid fire questions that are going to be much less serious than this. I want to ask you about your first car and your favorite drink and what you're doing when you're not working all the time on this really important work. But let me ask you a final question here if I can. What's next? What are people not seeing? You're great at elevating the story, ringing the alarm, and telling people, watch this. What do you think is the next big story or stories that people need to know about?
Watch three groups of cases very closely. And I try to dedicate part of my day each day to the cases of the accused Oath Keepers, the accused Proud Boys, and the accused 3%ers. To me, that's the heart of the action. That's where if there's going to be a next level, if there's going to be a transcendent moment or flip or switch, coming from one of those three cases. Those are three groups of accused far-right groups, all of whom are accused of something particularly either violent or next level on January 6th, many of whom are accused of long-term plotting and planning as early as November 4th, being ready to do something uniquely disruptive on January 6th. We've seen 5 of the accused Oath Keepers, I believe at least 5, plead guilty already and agree to flip. There are nearly 24 in that case. There are dozens total among those groups. That's where you want to focus. And we haven't seen any of them go to sentencing. All those cases are live and they're vibrant. And I try to keep that in context. When I look at 650 cases, you got to dedicate some of your bandwidth every day to those cases.
I want to just ask you one follow-up on that, Scott. So we're tracking now on members of the active duty, people who are police. Is there any indication that those core groups will flip and result in an indictment or an accusation involving a member of Congress or the administration? Do we have any insight into that?
I get that question a lot, and I give 2 responses. First of all, I think we've read every one of the tens of thousands of pages of court filings. We haven't even seen a benign reference to a member of Congress being at all involved. Even a nameless member of Congress. There's just nothing that's been said. And if they have those cards, they probably wouldn't show them right now.
Right.
So it doesn't preclude it from happening. It just hasn't happened. in what we've read. But the Oath Keepers, watch that case, because they were, at the time, and to a degree still, the top line defendants, the big fish, and they're flipping. Who are they flipping on? What are they giving up? You don't usually see the top line defendants go first in flipping. And I don't want to ask too provocative a question because I don't know the answer, but it's interesting. And I would keep watching it.
Yeah, and I think that's the one to watch. Did someone, give them an advanced recon? Did someone share security information, whether it was intentionally or accidentally, right? A member of Congress says, oh, here's where there's only one cop on the back door, and here there's always 5. Or just giving them access. If I were going to conduct an assault, I'd want to get intel. I'd want to get intel sources. I'd look for weak spots. And that's what I'm watching for. Maybe, of course, they're not going to show their cards at this point, but I think there is a possibility that down the line they go for that big shot, and it's someone that they're holding out on. And that's when things, if the timing works out, that's going to happen in the midterms. It's going to happen around the midterms. It's going to happen as Trump maybe declares that he's running again, and this is going to go on for years, right? Maybe even decades. I don't know how long. Is there a precedent for how long this can go? When does it end, Scott? Does it end?
Those of us who cover the federal courts, we are some patient people, man. It is a slow system in the best of times, and this is unprecedented times. This courthouse and the people who work there, they have a certain amount of spectrum, and they're not used to having 650 cases come in at once. They're used to having 200 to 300 cases a year. They have 650 of just this singular crime at once. So it's just sluggish as all get out. Plus, there's so much at stake. This is a multi-year thing we're in. But that, even with that aside, Paul, January 6th is a story that's bigger than that day. It's not just about the prosecutions. It's about how it changed our politics. It changed our view of government, how it changed our view of security, how it changed America, and how it's still doing all those things. This is the story of our lifetimes. And it didn't end January 7th. And when these cases come and these cases close, we're still a changed country. And that's why I'm so fixated on it, because this is the story of our lifetimes. This is September 12th and 2001 to a degree, because we are changed, and everybody involved is still here. And it's, you get the point. This is a way, this transformed America, and we have to stay diligent about following it.
I agree. And, maybe one of the only good parts of this is that now we have your reporting, and you have risen to this moment in a way that I believe is truly patriotic and a tremendous public service, and really represents the best of what American journalism is all about. I know it's been a hard time for journalists in America in the last couple of years. We've covered that on this story, but I think what you do takes tremendous courage. You have great integrity, and we say on the show all the time, stay vigilant, and you are embodying that every day. So I thank you for your work. We're going to track it closely and try to elevate it as often as we can, and I hope you can come back again. And until then, more than anybody else, I ask you, please stay vigilant, Scott.
Of course.